Hello, Plain Talk members. The big issue now is the federal budget. Our current mess has everyone's attention. Congress is finally geared up to tackle the issue. The White House is staking out its position. The budget and the associated deficits are a hot topic. There's much at stake. Nothing normal about this year. The numbers tell it all. Let's take a look. The government's fiscal year ends on September 30th of each year. The deficit each year is the excess of what the government spends over what it collects in taxes during that year. For fiscal years 2002 through 2007, the annual deficit averaged $278 billion a year. These deficit numbers varied from year to year, were a concern to many, and caused the Congressional Budget Office to continually warn Congress about the risk of perpetual deficits that drive up the federal debt. You see, each year's deficit is added on to the federal public debt, which the government finances by selling Treasury notes. In 2002, the public debt, which represented the deficits of all prior years, totaled $3.5 trillion. During the period 2002 through 2007, the federal public debt grew from $3.5 trillion to over $5 trillion. Then 2008 hit. The recessionary impacts were being felt. That year's deficit grew to $458 billion, the largest of all time. The Congressional Budget Office issued this warning to Congress on January 9, 2009. For every $100 billion in additional federal debt, future taxpayers will probably have to pay about $5 billion a year in interest costs. But 2008 was just a prelude of what was to come. In fiscal 2009, federal tax revenues totaled $2.1 trillion, while federal expenditures skyrocketed to $3.5 trillion, up 18% from the prior year 2008. The result was a one-year deficit of $1.4 trillion, a number that no one could have imagined just a few years earlier. The government's public debt ballooned to over $7.5 trillion. Fiscal year 2010, which ended just last September, brought more of the same, with tax revenues at $2.1 trillion, expenditures at over $3.4 trillion, and another $1 trillion deficit. This one, $1.3 trillion. The federal public debt had grown to over $9 trillion by the end of last September, an 80% increase over the 2007 level. Worse yet, the Congressional Budget Office projected in January 2011 that for the current year ending this next September, expenditures will grow to over $3.7 trillion on revenues of $2.2 trillion, producing a deficit of $1.5 trillion. It will be a three-peat of trillion-dollar-plus annual deficits. So for the year we're in right now, the government will collect less than 60 cents for each dollar spent. As a result, the public debt is projected to exceed $10.4 trillion by the end of September. Now how about beyond this coming September? For the years 2012 through 2021, the CBO projects annual deficits averaging $697 billion each year, a steady increase in the public debt, with the public debt totaling more than $18 trillion by 2021. But as scary as these future numbers are, they likely could be much worse. You see, the CBO projections assume that the average annual nominal growth in gross domestic product, GDP, will be 5.2% from 2013 to 2016 and 4.4% thereafter. That the unemployment rate will continually ratchet down, hitting 5.3% in 2016 and staying down. And that all favorable existing tax breaks and special benefits will expire on schedule and not be renewed, thus producing more revenues for the government. So for budget purposes, the projections assume, for example, that all the favorable Bush tax rates will go away for everyone after 2012, including all middle and low-income taxpayers. That sharp reductions in Medicare physician rates will take effect at the end of 2011 and won't be renewed. And that extensions of unemployment compensation benefits and the existing limits on the reaches of the alternative minimum tax will all expire at the end of 2011 and will not be renewed. If Congress chooses to extend these benefits, as it has done in the past, some repeatedly, another $4.9 trillion could be added to the public debt, bringing the total public debt to an unimaginable $23 trillion by 2021. The other hard reality is that CBO projections can't factor in how things will play out in the economy or in the Congress, so they might miss by a mile, turn out much worse. As an example, in January 2008, just 3 years ago, the CBO projected that the fiscal 2011 annual deficit would be only $117 billion. It missed by 92% the $1.5 trillion 2011 projected deficit. And as for the public debt, 3 years ago, it was projected to be less than $5.8 trillion by the end of 2011, just over half of the $10.4 trillion now projected by the end of September. Now, in fairness, 36 months ago, the Congressional Budget Office could not foresee the economic turmoil of the last few years, the huge increase in government spending, and the resulting huge negative impacts on the public debt and the financial health of the nation. So too, looking forward, the assumptions of serious growth, descending unemployment rates, and Congress's willingness to get tough on taxes and spending could prove false. Now, if you've listened to the news recently, you've likely heard that there's a push to raise the federal debt ceiling, now set at $14.3 trillion. There's another piece to the debt puzzle that accounts for the gap in this debt ceiling number and the existing public debt. It's the debt held by public accounts, also known as the trust fund debt. It's now about $4.7 trillion, which when added to the public debt makes up the total federal debt, which will soon hit the ceiling of $14.3 trillion. The trust fund debt represents money the government has borrowed from certain trust funds to finance its general operations. The bulk is from the Social Security Trust Fund. Here's a little of the backstory on this one. When Social Security was projected to go bankrupt in the early 80s, President Reagan appointed a bipartisan commission headed by Alan Greenspan to save Social Security. The result was a sweeping bill in 1983 that accelerated billions of future payroll tax increases and promised that huge surpluses would be generated during the years preceding the retirement of the baby boomers. It was expressly promised that this surplus would save young Americans from having to fund boomer benefits. Big payroll taxes came as promised. For low and middle income America, the tax is a killer, much worse than any income tax bite. For 80% of Americans, the payroll tax hit on their incomes exceeds their federal income tax liability. The huge surpluses for the government, as promised in 1983, also came. Trillions of dollars of excess payroll taxes have been collected over the past 28 years to pre-fund the benefits of the baby boomers. What happened to this money? Where did it go? That's what some call the deceit, the shell game, the fraud. Every dime of this money, generated from a flat rate tax imposed on the labor earnings of primarily low-end and middle America, has been used to pay general operating expenses of the federal government unrelated to Social Security. The promised trust funds have been blown. What Social Security has to show for these blown surpluses are non-marketable IOUs of the federal Treasury. That's what represents the bulk of the current trust fund debt. The bottom line is that the government's pre-funding plan for the baby boomers boomeranged. This plan, hatched in 1983 to pre-fund the Social Security burden of the baby boomers, was from the very start a gimmick, an accounting scheme that has allowed the government to shift a big part of its current operating budget onto the backs of lower and middle income America, while shifting the full future funding burden of all retirement benefits for the boomers to future generations. But the payroll tax gravy train has now ended. No longer do Social Security payroll taxes exceed payouts. The IOUs are coming due. This year, the shortfall between what is actually collected and paid out is projected to be $45 billion, and the shortfall will perpetually grow bigger as the boomers, the first of whom reached 65 in 2011, keep stepping up to claim their benefits. By 2025, the ratio of those paying in to those taking out, which is now 3.1 to 1, will have dropped to 2.3 to 1. So how big a deal are these escalating, unprecedented, multi-trillion-dollar public and trust fund debts that could easily top $20 trillion in the foreseeable future? That question was answered in the long-awaited report of the President's National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform. The report was entitled The Moment of Truth. It was issued in December, just a few months ago. Although there was not broad-based support for its proposals, all agreed to its central message. If the U.S. does not put its house in order, the reckoning will be sure and the devastation severe, because our federal debt is unsustainable. Just consider how much $20 trillion really is. It's more than $173,000 for each household in America. If you took the 2010 spending budget of every state in the union, added them all together, and then multiplied the total by 12, you would still be short of $20 trillion. And as for the future annual interest tab, the CBO's latest projections say the interest burden will skyrocket. Under their favorable assumptions previously described, the annual interest burden on the gross federal debt is projected to exceed $739 billion by 2015 and to surpass $1.1 trillion by 2020. The negative financial drain on all Americans of having to shell out each year over $1 trillion of interest on an old debt that just keeps growing is hard to imagine. Perhaps that's why it's so easily ignored by our elected representatives on both sides of the aisle. All who witnessed the political theatrics of Congress and the White House struggling during the last days of 2010 with the bill to extend the Bush tax cuts were vividly reminded of this reality. Although the Moment of Truth report of the Fiscal Responsibility Commission was less than 2 weeks old, and fiscal discipline was the hot rhetoric, fiscal responsibility was once again thrown out the window as the compromise of the 2010 tax bill granted unfunded unemployment benefit extensions and across-the-board tax breaks for everyone, triggering a new stimulus bill that promised to add hundreds of billions of dollars to the national debt. As each side rushed to proclaim victory, alleging that it had out-negotiated the other side, only a handful of elected representatives expressed any concern with the associated costs and deficits. And given the vote tallies in both the House and the Senate, the bill can't be blamed on the lame duckers. Once again, each side had proven that in the heat of battle to get what it wants, it will sacrifice fiscal responsibility in the spirit of compromise and the need to generate sound bites that appeal to its base. It's always easier and more popular to be fiscally irresponsible. Both sides have helped big time to create this problem, and it will take both sides working together to formulate sensible solutions. The next few months should be telling. What most Americans don't need or even want are more undefined promises of future actions or new economies or continued mindless neglect. The Fiscal Responsibility Commission got it right. This is the moment of truth. The numbers say it all. Across the board, Americans need right now that confidence that comes with an understandable, plausible scenario that has the potential of controlling the situation and stopping the bleeding without doing untold damage to the dollar and the future standard of living of all Americans. Something specific, concrete, where anyone can connect the dots and honestly conclude this just might work. Thanks for your time.